Hello, my name is Paul and welcome to my 5-part series on how to make the sterling silver statement ring. This ring will feature a natural Dalmatian gemstone set in a fine silver bezel with a decorative border and split shank. If you enjoyed this video and like to see more, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and click that little bell icon to get notifications of future releases. Here in part 1 of this video series, I'll go over the recommended materials and some of the tools you may want to use. If you're already familiar with basic silversmithing and have a good understanding of what is required for this project, you may just want to skip on to part 2 of this series. Depending on when you are watching this, the rest of the series will be available on my YouTube channel if it already isn't. As always, feel free to leave any questions in the comment section below. I'd also like to note that in silversmithing there are many different ways to accomplish the same end result. I may use one technique in this video but do it a little different in another video, or I may just not know another way to do it. We are always learning, so if you have experience with another method or a suggestion, please by all means share it in the comments below. I promise it's not going to offend me one bit, and it may teach me or someone else a little something extra in this video. Now let's get this project started. For this project, I've selected this medium-sized Dalmatian jasper Cabochon gemstone. A good Cabochon stone will have one side that is completely flat and smooth and that may or may not be polished. Every stone is unique and has its own set of characteristics. This is why we choose the stone first, as everything else we do will be worked around it. This particular oval stone measures roughly 25 mm by 19 mm and is 5 mm at the thickest point. For the back plate, I'm going to use a piece of 22 gauge sterling silver sheet. 22 gauge is a fairly common thickness to be used as a back plate. It can be adjusted up or down depending on the size of the stone. I'll go over how to select the height of the bezel in a minute, but for this project I'll be using a piece of 26 gauge fine silver. As for how to determine the height or width of the bezel you're going to use, I'm just going to start by apologizing in advance for this clip being a little bit out of focus. Here you'll notice that a good Cabochon stone should be evenly domed on the top and that the edges are tapered inwards into a slight radius. This is important. In later steps after the stone is placed in the bezel, you'll be rolling the bezel around the stone to lock it in place. If the bezel isn't tall enough to be rolled over the tapered radius edge, you risk the stone being able to fall out. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if it's too tall, you'll be covering up an unnecessary amount of the stone. Try and envision the final result as you test the wire around the stone, choosing a height that is just reached above where the taper starts. As you can see, this stone isn't perfect, but it's pretty close to having uniform edge on all sides. Just for reference, this wire is 3/16 of an inch wide. We are going to add a single decorative border around this stone. There's plenty of options for a border, but you don't have to use one at all if you don't want. For this project, I'm going to use a piece of 14 gauge sterling silver twisted rope pattern wire. You can make this yourself, and maybe I'll do a video on that down the road, but for now I'm just going to use this. There are lots of options for ring shanks, from very simple to very extravagant. For this ring, I'm going to find a happy medium and fabricate a split shank. I'm going to use a piece of 16 gauge sterling silver that is about 1.3 mm thick and 4 mm in width. All of the material choices that I'm using for this particular ring are just to be used as guidelines. You can select alternative materials if you like, or if you're like me, sometimes you just use whatever you have on hand at the moment. Now let's move on to some of the tools you may want to use. Tools. My collection seems to always be growing. For this project, we need some basic silversmithing tools, but nothing too out of the ordinary. I'm going to quickly list off most of the tools I use in this series. I'll get into greater detail on how I use these tools as the series moves on. Don't worry about writing everything down. I'll post a complete list and links in the video description below. I have no doubt I've probably left a few things out, and there are plenty of alternative choices to what I'll be showing, but it's a good start. First thing you'll need is a good place to work. I built this jeweler's bench setup you see here myself for a fraction of the cost of a commercial bot bench. You don't need something this elaborate to get started, but you do need a solid table of some sort to work on. You're also going to need some sort of a fume and smoke extraction system unless you're working in a very well ventilated area. I built this system myself that vents to the outside air. Fire extinguisher, because you never know, and keep it close by. Bench pin. I use a GRS Benchmate pin that I can quickly remove as needed, but there are models that just clamp on any tabletop. Flat surface. It's nice to have a perfectly flat surface for sanding and aligning parts. This is a piece of granite surface plate. Calipers for precision measurements. I prefer the digital models as it's a very quick reference. An optivisor. You wear these on your headlight glasses to magnify your workpiece. They also provide partial eye protection. Flush cut side snips. These little cutters are great for small gauge wire. Jeweler saw. There are less expensive saws available, but I really like this model. Saw blades. Get yourself an assortment. I use a number 5 for rough cutting thicker plate and smaller blades for piercing and precision cutting. A soldering surface. There are lots of options, but you're going to need something like this that's heat resistant. Turntable. I like to place these turntables under my soldering board so I can easily rotate my workpiece. Silver solder. You don't need both sheet and wire solder. I would have easy, medium, and hard solder all on hand. We'll go more over why throughout the series. Torch. You can use a simple propane or butane torch for this project if you have one, but I'll be using my Smith Little torch. This is a very nice oxygen propane torch with interchangeable tips. The original setup I purchased utilized 2 disposable tanks, but I quickly upgraded to this setup with a much larger oxygen tank. I'll probably make a separate video discussing how and why I made that switch. Flux. I'll be using both paste and liquid flux. It's also nice to have one of these little squeeze bottle applicators for the liquid flux, but you can just use a small brush. Parallel pliers. These are nice and they also come with nylon grips to help protect the silver from scratches. Big snips for cutting heavier gauge material. Tweezers for moving everything around and picking up very tiny objects. Copper tongs for moving items in and out of pickle solution. They must be copper as not to react with a pickle. A pickle pot. I use this cheap slow cooker to keep the solution warm. Pickle for cleaning oxidation and excess flux off your silver. I use Sparex number 2. Sandpaper. I use an assortment of wet dry and various grits. Files. An assortment of both large metal and needle files. Sanding sticks. These are store-bought, but you can make your own. Soldering tripod. For soldering from underneath. Heavy-duty screen for on top of the tripod. The screen that comes with the tripod won't last very long. Forceps. These come in very handy sometimes. Half-round pliers for bending material round without kinking. Ring size gauge for both measuring ring size and taking measurements from. An oval mandrel. A round ring mandrel with markings. Stamps. In this project we'll be using a .925 stamp to identify that sterling silver was used, and also your maker's mark stamp if you have one. This one has my logo on it. Hammers. I'll be using both a chasing hammer and a plastic mallet. Ring clamps or vise. You're going to need something to firmly hold the ring while you do the final processes. You can use one of these inexpensive ring clamps, but I'm going to use this ball vise with an expanding ring holder. Bezel roller. For stone setting by rolling the bezel over the stone. Burnishing tool, also used for setting the stone. Silver black to add some patina to our project. Flex shaft. You can also use a Dremel rotary tool if you have one. Various bits for cleaning and polishing the ring. Polishing motor. This piece of equipment isn't necessary, but if you have a motor and some buffs, this makes life a lot easier, but you can just use some bits with your rotary tool. Make sure you wear a dust mask when polishing, as the particles can be harmful. I built this dust collection system out of some plywood and a shop vac. It's a little more complicated than that, but that'll be another video. Polishing compounds. In this video I'll be using a bobbing compound, a green low-speed compound, and a red rouge for the final polish. A tumbler. Finally, this is a magnetic tumbler. This is absolutely not required, but has some nice benefits that I'll go over as we work. Now that we've got everything we need for this ring, it's time to move on to part 2 of this series. In part 2 I'll go over how to form and solder the bezel and backplate all together.